And we are live. Hello, and welcome to Krakin Krakoa, to the Comic Book Herald.com YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining, everybody. We will get officially started here in just a minute once we know that everything is up and running as it should be. The plan today, of course, is to continue the 90s X-Men Reading Club. I'm Dave, the founder and editor-in-chief of Comic Book Herald. I am joined today by CBH writer supreme John Galati. But again, we will do our official introduction here in about 1 minute. Give people a second to hop on.
Sure.
If, as you're listening, you can let us know how volume sounds, how quality is coming through, that is appreciated as well. It always, I always get this thing, John. It says the audio stream's current bit rate is lower than the recommended bit rate. But I have no idea what to make of that.
I mean, it might be something with your outgoing settings. I mean, your audio shouldn't be pre-compressed, right? I wouldn't think so.
I don't know how it would be.
I mean, unless the software is somehow doing that.
Yeah, my understanding of compression is basically grabbing the graph and just moving it around until things sound better. Like a lunatic.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah,
Sure.
Not super advanced. All right, let me tweet this out as well. And we'll just go ahead and get started and let people trickle in. All right.
Compressed, right? I wouldn't think so.
Oops. That I don't want. All right, let's get to it. Hello and welcome to Comic Book Herald's 90s X-Men Reading Club. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. I am joined today by CBH writer supreme John Galati. We are going to be talking all things New Mutants, and we're going to be talking about these specific issues 87 to 94. Okay, these are New Mutants comics that came out as we entered the year 1990, as we move in the X-Men Reading Club through X-Men history, through chronologically, year by year, through 1990 through to about 2000. So much like we've done in the My Marvelous Year Club, which I would highly recommend people check out. It's Comic Book Herald podcast that I do with co-host Zach Dean. We go through a same approach. Chronologically, we go year by year through Marvel Comics history. We read a curated selection of the essentials within Marvel Comics. This X-Men 90s Reading Club, we're doing a very similar thing, but we're digging in specifically to the world of mutants, since that is so much of what I cover here on the CBH YouTube channel on Krakin Krakoa, where I talk present-day X-Men. Now, John, before I throw it to you to introduce yourself and talk X-Men a bit, I do just want to mention, too, like, this will be a conversation we're having about the introduction of Cable in the Marvel Universe, okay? About kind of the introduction of Rob Liefeld, in a lot of ways, to the Marvel Universe, right? Which is a bigger character. We'll decide, I think, as we talk about this. But this will be with the idea of talking about like what is going on in the current era in contemporary Krakoan X-Men comics as well, okay? So it's not like spoiler free, like, oh, read along in 1990 and by the time we get to 2021 we'll know what's going on. No, this is with the full picture of X-Men history. So it's not like super spoiler heavy. I'm not going to like try to spoil something, but if you don't want to know anything about what happens in the future of X-Men, you just want to go through it chronologically, then the My Marvelous Year Reading Club is the club for you. This 90s X-Men Club is going to be a little more whole scope of what's going on in the Marvel Universe as it stands today. So, all right, with that said, John, thanks so much for joining. I appreciate you hopping on to talk about these comics. Before we went back to these and you hopped on to talk about this, what was your familiarity with the debut of Cable and kind of this era of New Mutants? Like, what's your broad like perspective and kind of like what your fandom is around these stories?
So I really didn't pick up. I mean, like I read about Cable during the Madeline Pryor Fallout stuff when he was still an infant.
But was that Cable?
Well.
See, right off the bat, we've got creative challenges.
Yeah. So I picked him back up to that point. I picked him back up on X-Force #1, like everybody else did, in the 90s. And they were already by then really pushing the whole Cable Strife, Summers Kid thing.
Yeah.
And I sort of sidelined Cable in favor of Bishop. Really,
Really,
that they're
okay.
both they're
That
both
was
pretty
your
similar
preferred
characters.
time traveler. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Cable is. I liked Cable's Apocalypse storyline, but like they were the writers and artists were just jerking around about the whole Strife, Mr. Sinister, Apocalypse, Nathan Summers quadrangle
Yeah.
mess of things for too long. And on top of which, I liked New Mutants. Back when Sienkiewicz was doing it, I didn't become a huge fan when Cable took over. It just changed the book when he tried to change the kids over into Obvious Soldiers.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying you were turned off by that vibe. So that's the thing. So like New Mutants 87, it's the debut of Rob Liefeld as the artist on New Mutants, okay? And Louise Simonson continues writing it through this stretch. And it's very clear. It simultaneously, like, there's a brief window, like 87 through 90, where this actually feels like a collaboration of Simonson's New Mutants with Liefeld's artistic energy and vision for new characters like a Cable. But then by the time you hit like 91 even, and it kind of then the series then progresses on a march towards Extinction Agenda, then it becomes like, oh, this isn't Louise Simonson's book anymore. She like lost control of it, like maybe not even lost, just like it. She's been on the title, I mean, for so long. Like I think a lot of people, myself included, overlook like how long Louise Simonson writes New Mutants. It's almost 50 issues, right? Like she has this book for a good long stretch. But this transition of both art, of energy, of style, and of approach, of migrating the New Mutants from the young mutant kids of the X-Men universe to like these paramilitary shock troopers at Cable's behest, that is a severe transition that happens in these comics. And I can see from your perspective like how in the moment how that would be kind of startling, I guess, and kind of unappealing. I think like you said, the Claremont Sienkiewicz era of New Mutants, definitely my favorite. That comes a number of years before this point, earlier in the 80s. That is when we get to see these kids, as mutants discovering their powers. It's a really wonderful addition to the mutant universe because the core X-Men lineup is so caught up in mutant battles all the time, they don't have time for slumber parties, right?
Yeah.
Which is something that the kid New Mutants get to do. By the time we get to enter Cable, that era has kind of passed. That era of these kids, like they've been through so much. I mean, just like to kind of like conceptualize, like, well, what has happened in Fall of the Mutants? Doug Ramsey dies. Okay, he's killed. You have basically this team. Professor X leaves them after the trial of Magneto because he's hurt. That's an Uncanny X-Men 200. Professor X is in space then for the rest of the 80s. Like, I feel like people overlook that from 1985 to 1991 until X-Men #1, Professor X is in space with Lilandra and like the Shi'ar. Like, it's a long time. It's amazing. It is. But Magneto then is supposed to take over as the headmaster and, kind of the caretaker of these kids, of these New Mutants.
And he bails.
And then he bails. And that's where we're at when we get to New Mutants 87 is, I want to say it's around like New Mutants 75, maybe even during Acts of Vengeance, but like Magneto, I really like Magneto's arc, and we've talked about it a fair amount through a number of other conversations we've had on podcasts and whatnot, but like, I like his efforts to be the headmaster everybody wants him to be, to turn that corner, but ultimately he's kind of just not good at it. And I don't know that he's even worse than Professor X. He might be better at it, actually, but he does literally just leave the kids to their own devices after he gets fed up, basically, by the end of it. So these kids are just like living alone in a mansion by the time Cable shows up. And that's one thing that kind of recurs throughout this section of Cable stories is like they are desperate for a leader. They are desperate for an adult presence to kind of like help them understand what the heck to do. And Cable is kind of a really interesting fit in that regard. So I guess is your challenge with Cable coming in, do you kind of just wish it had immediately become X-Force as opposed to this slow winding build in New Mutants to get to X-Force? Or do you feel like there's a need for like to establish Cable and kind of improve, like make the case for him being the leader of these kids, I guess, in New Mutants?
Well, I mean, I guess the first part to answer that is like, does this series actually establish Cable?
Yeah.
Because I mean, we'll get into it a little bit later, but like the Cable in these early issues is radically different than what I think of Cable, or what I'm sure a lot of our readers and listeners think of as Cable.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's just very. I mean, the did you read up on the origin of the character before this?
I did. I did a lot of research, actually.
Okay.
More than usual, because there's two pieces.
I love it when you do research.
I know. There's two pieces to Cable's origin that I find very interesting. One is the actual like character design, and like, was he conceptualized as a Summers immediately? You know, like, was how the time travel aspects, like how much of that was solidified early. And then the second piece of it is the comics fan who created Cable, you know, from a talent perspective piece, right?
Yeah.
That is, you have Louise Simonson as the writer, you have Rob Liefeld as the artist, you have Bob Harris as an editor of the title at the time, who is like saying things to everyone and maybe not the same information's being given all the time. It definitely sounds like to me. So all right, so I'll let you start. What were you going to say regarding the creation and the intention of Cable?
Oh, it's the fascinating story about the fact that I think it was Harris actually who wanted the new leader for New Mutants, and contacted Simonson and Liefeld. Liefeld showed up with drawings that he had wanted to do for a villain originally, and
of a character named Strife. He had the name Strife at that point.
Yes,
according to everyone.
Obviously the backstory is whatever else, but like he had that character design as a totally different character.
Yeah.
Harris just wanted to shoehorn this guy into a more heroic role because he looks cool. There's apparently, from what I read, there's a little bit of tension between the three of them, between Simonson, Liefeld, and Harris, about like the exact makeup and build of this character and who was in control of it. It seems a lot like I love Wheezy, and she has a great track record of letting artists really shine on books.
Yeah,
she does. If you go back to her Wolverine and Havoc, like the story can be a little bit light at times, but she gets way the hell out of the way for Williams and who's the other guy on that book? It's Kent Williams and whoever.
You're talking about the Meltdown miniseries?
Yeah.
I do not remember. I just know that's the name.
Yeah. It's this great, beautiful, painterly thing that she did a great job of having a lot of humility to step out of the way and let her artist shine on it.
Yeah.
And that's clearly what she's trying to do here with Liefeld, but she gives up everything right from the get-go, including like naming him Cable.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, as a side note, bothers me as we are now entering into the era of Rob Liefeld meaningless naming conventions on heroes.
Yeah.
So let's pull that up here. I've got a short list of them somewhere.
Amazing. And I do have
just
to plug
from these
here.
comics.
I do have to plug here while you're pulling this up that in my view, John has written the definitive Rob Liefeld comics history, which you can find on comicbookherald.com. I should include in the show notes after we're done here. The title, like the subtitle, is A Tale of Two Dogs Fighting. It's a very good and very nuanced look at a creator that gets a ton of attention. You know, Rob Liefeld has become, I think, he is discussed as like a concept as opposed to like a real person at this point in comics history.
It's like a cottage industry.
Yeah, exactly. And like, you know, it's a lot of people have very strong opinions about him as a creator, and a lot of times rightfully so. He has definitely not helped himself, I think, in terms of public perception. But it's really interesting to read his early Marvel work and get a feel for like, oh, this is why this guy blew up. You know what I mean? Like, like there's an energy and a willingness to design and experiment characters in very fun ways that will not only come to like shape the decade, but in the moment for New Mutants is extremely, extremely appealing. Like as we get back to these comics, as we talk about again, New Mutants 87 to like 90 specifically, I love these issues. They're really good. Their Cable is surprisingly nuanced. I think this is when Louise Simonson and Liefeld as a collaborative unit actually function well together. You have the energy of Liefeld, but you have the structure and the experience of Wheezy, and it comes together so nicely in like a really good mutant story. And we'll get into the specifics. But as you were saying, though, like Liefeld then he goes on to become one of the Image guys with Todd McFarlane, who inks a lot of these covers, which helps Liefeld out tremendously.
There's a big conversation to be had about the responsibility of Todd McFarlane really for making Liefeld become who he was, because his inking on his pieces are, I mean, that work is beautiful. It's incredibly well done.
It's amazing how much better it looks too. And not to like throw shade at, I think like Scott Williams, who's an inker who does a lot of Jim Lee stuff in the 90s and like well regarded. Yeah. But you look at a McFarlane inked piece compared to the Williams ink piece covers of those era, and it's night and day. Like those covers are astonishingly good when you have McFarlane's presence, which shouldn't be surprising because he had just crushed it on everything from Incredible Hulk to Amazing Spider-Man, and he's becoming like the superstar, of the Image guys era, right? But it's McFarlane, it's Liefeld, and it's Jim Lee, and then of course others are going to fill in: Jim Valentino, Will Spertasio, right? Others, but Liefeld, this is the era where he's like, I'm gonna be a star, and here's how I'm gonna do it, and that's a lot of why, like, even just getting him to be on New Mutants, you can watch videos of him. Like, I think the biggest problem with him in terms of the creative credit debate, in terms of like, because there's an argument now about basically any character he's tied to, there becomes an argument over who created Deadpool, right? Who created Cable? And a lot of times, I think the answer tends to be, well, Rob Liefeld did like most of it. Like, you would give most creative credit. The problem, I think, becomes with these characters specifically, I should say, Cable and Deadpool. The problem becomes that he tries to take all the credit now. Like, he tries to take literally all of it, and I think he does himself no favors because he diminishes the contributions of a Louise Simonson in characterizing and also, like, being involved in the process. Louise Simonson, the Simonsons, not known for their outlandish claims about taking creative credit. You know what I mean?
No, they're well stocked on accomplishments. They don't need to grab extra.
Exactly. So I think it looks quite bad for Liefeld because he's like, no, this is all mine. He kind of does a similar thing with Deadpool and Fabian DCA's these days. And I think it's that piece of it where he's like, it's kind of like the reverse Stan Lee. Because Stan Lee, like, he kind of like got all the credit early, didn't maybe say enough, but then later in his career was like, no, of course, that was me and Jack, but it was too late. Liefeld's like doing the reverse of that, where he's like, no, actually, it was all me. And people are like, no, it's too late. Like, we already have enough information to know that's probably not the case. Anyway, you were going to say, what are Liefeld's naming conventions?
Oh, yeah. So, first of all, you're right. Like, Liefeld is really what I'm going to be talking about him on this book. It's more like as an aesthetic. Like he has this incredibly big role in creating stuff, but a lot of the characters, well, I get into it more in the article that you mentioned earlier, but a lot of his characters are just, they don't contain the things that we remember. He didn't give the things that we should remember about them, I should say.
Well, Deadpool's the strongest example of that, because when we think of the comedy, when we think of the quips, when we think of him loving chimichangas, that stuff doesn't come from Rob. Right?
No, not remotely, no. So, like, this enters, as I was saying, the age of terrible naming conventions that Rob Liefeld had. Like, previously, your superhero characters had some kind of cliched code name or call sign. Cyclops shoots a laser beam, so they name him after a one-eyed giant. Or Phoenix comes back from the dead. Wolverine is, Batman is, Superman is, etc. Liefeld starts naming characters that just sound cool, but tell you nothing about them. And half the time, their character design doesn't even tell you a damn thing.
Right.
Like, for instance, Shatterstar, one of his creations. What the hell does Shatterstar do?
One would presume cosmically can bust apart, like cosmic entities, stars, planets, etc., right?
Sure, something. No, he's a good swordsman, and he has avian bones. He's from the future, because all Rob Liefeld characters are from the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has nothing to do with cosmic stuff. Then in this book, we've got a character named Skids who has Bioforce Field. I don't know what that is. The character Rusty predates Rob Liefeld's interaction.
Rusty and Skids are pre-Liefeld,
Yeah. But that doesn't make sense. Zero, the teleporter, Wildside, who's Wolverine if he was a party clown, Tempo, who has the power of why bother, Super Saber, who's a speedster.
I will not stand for that Tempo slander. Tempo's having a renaissance.
You
This is
need to
Tempo's
explain to
time.
me how do her powers function in this series?
So let's actually talk about that.
Not using the future stuff.
Yeah.
How does it function here?
Right. Okay. Tempo can create time bubbles, right? I think of her like, did you ever watch Heroes on NBC?
A little bit.
There was the character Hero was his name, but
Yeah.
he's I forget what country, but he's an Asian man, and
Yeah.
his name is like Hiro. He can control time, and he can create like time bubbles. I think that's kind of what Tempo does. Is she can create like time bubbles that then within that sphere, her team can move faster, slower, etc. Change things up.
But why does it exhaust them?
Why does it exhaust them? That I don't. I mean, I've never been pushed forward or backwards through time, so I don't know how tired I'd be.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some kind of temporal hangover, but the characters describe their experience with super speed as being exhausting
Yeah.
through time, and I'm like, what happened to relativity? I don't. It's strange.
It's not. There's not a lot of science in these ideas, but there is a lot of just energy and action. And like you're saying, the idea of like design and aesthetic that can be summed up as cool. And
Yeah.
and it doesn't really need to be a lot more than that. And I think so like talking about Temple, let's start there because New Mutants 87, it's not only the introduction of Cable, but it's the introduction of the Mutant Liberation Front and Strife as antagonists that we're going to see New Mutants and Cable have to face here as this series. Again, like we're in the bottom stretch. We're in the home stretch of New Mutants as a title existing. Okay, that's where we're at in Marvel in 1990 is like the idea of having the New Mutants, like they're kind of like, okay, this time has passed, let's push it. And what it gets pushed to is X-Force, right? Is this new book.
Yeah.
But all the buildup for Mutant Liberation Front, for Strife as an antagonist, which is not stuff that I realized, honestly, like until I went back and read these New Mutants comics. That's all here. I mean, Strife's in New Mutants 87. Right off the bat, Liefeld's like, here's all the stuff. Here's all the ideas. And I think that is where he brings the best energy to a book like this is just like, we're just going to throw out, like you said, like Wildside, Tempo. Like there's just going to be a bunch of new characters and maybe not all of them will stick, but some of them will look really cool and some of them will be really fun to hang out with. And that part of it's going to be fun. And then obviously we saw the excesses of that as the 90s progressed. But I do think one thing that I think Simonson's role in this, and some of this is presumptive on my part. It is very difficult to know who exactly did what, right? And what does it even mean to have created something? But I do think Simonson, as an experienced writer, as a very talented creator who, shapes New Mutants and X Factor throughout the entirety of the late 80s, she gives, basically the Mutant Liberation Front, she gives them the shape and the feel and the structure of a new Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And Strife is the new Magneto. And I find those parallels actually very interesting because it's just ever so slightly modernized, right? It's not the Silver Age, literal like Brotherhood of Evil Mutants naming, but it's the Mutant Liberation Front. And they're very clearly set up as a quote unquote terrorist organization, but they also have that tricky nuance that is tricky even today, I think, for X-Men readers of, but they're fighting for mutant rights, but maybe their methods are in question. And I think there is it's not really played with in these stories, like the nuance of it, but there's at least that potential seated in the Mutant Liberation Front as antagonists.
Yeah. I do like the fact that she introduces them without the classic bickering that usually takes place in those supervillain teams when we first have to introduce them. We have to show who's vying for control, and there's not as much of that. I mean, there's some classic supervillainy, and that Strife immediately starts strangling Wildchild, but also that's totally understandable because I hate that character. Him and Crimson Commando.
Crimson Commando always, so Freedom Force, it has a nice role here in issues 87 through 90 as well. And basically anyone who's not Blob, Pyro, Mystique, Destiny in Freedom Force, they just never work for me. Like I can never even remember Crimson Commando's name, which is funny because they're around like almost as much as part of Freedom Force. For people who don't know, Freedom Force ironically, they are an X Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. This is the one founded by Mystique. and they become basically like a government arm of a totally mutant team. They're kind of like a Suicide Squad, but without the Amanda Waller control and chips in their head. Like they're more free reign than that. But I find them they just show up so much throughout this era because they show up all over the place. They're Captain America in the Grunwald run. They're in Spider-Man crossover stuff. Like they're all over the place. I like them showing up here as threats that Cable needs to deal with as he kind of comes into this world. And the other piece that I really love that Liefeld and Simonson do well here is people know Cable. So like Blob and Pyro, they're like, oh, Cable, I've heard about him. So like he's so mysterious. He's got the time travel thing, but we don't know any of the specifics, and we won't for a long time, honestly. And that's what they do a good job of with Cable, much in the school of Wolverine, of we're going to tease out a past and a future in this case that people have connections to, but we don't know the details, and they get slow rolled and sort of played out over the course of the 90s. And as we do this 90s X-Men reading club, we'll see much more and more of that. But I really like Blob, and then by the time we get to New Mutants 93 and 94, Wolverine has the same thing where he's like, oh, it's Cable. I'm always fighting this guy. Like there's a whole history of characters running into this guy. That's fun. I enjoy that.
I mean, that's neat, but there's also a little bit of it that doth protest too much, and that like at the end of one issue, I think it's 91, and the beginning of the other issue, I think it's 92. Crimson Commando spends 2 times pointing out how cool or stylish Cable is, like as his first commentary on the situation. I mean, Cable has an attack helicopter, and he's talking about how Cable, he's always got style. You got to say that about him. I'm like, okay, we get it. Like Cable's the coolest character we've ever seen.
Yeah.
All right. He's going to fight Wolverine. Yep. Man, though, you bring up the Blob. Liefeld turns in some great Blob artwork.
Yeah.
Like some truly top tier stuff, which I did not remember at all. And Blob isn't usually one of my favorite characters, but between him really getting the whole size proportion issue is fun, and there are a couple scenes where they show that Blob has just horrible teeth.
Yeah,
that really make you focus on his mouth, which is unsettling given his size. Like it's little touches like that where I'm like, Liefeld has his talents. No, that cover's terrible. What is going on? What is going on with Blob's head?
Blob's jaw and jowls combo is very caricaturish. You know what, though? I think to your point, this is not the best example. There is better stuff out there, but I think there is definitely there's a willingness of Liefeld to expand proportions in ways that are atypical for comics artists at this time. I think we see it in Cable, of course, in that his biceps are going to grow and grow and grow in ways that can be kind of fun. But you see it, too, with his design for Sabretooth. And I'm going to see if I can pull this up, where, like, basically, as I'm reading these, I keep asking him, like, is that Wild Child? Is that, like, Wild Side? Is that one of these different characters? And it's like, no, this is just Rob's vision of Sabretooth, and I don't actually like it that much, but I like the gumption. I like that he went for
it. he really did. And I don't remember, was the Larry Hama stretch before this? It had to be, right? It had to begin before this.
Of what? Of Wolverine?
Of Wolverine, yeah.
No, Hama's coming on to Wolverine about the same time. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because this comic has a lot of the same coloration decisions that I would usually pair up with Hama.
Yeah.
And his, I think he had Silvestri on that book, and whoever the artist was on the initial run has a similar-ish take on Sabretooth, except with a little less hair and a little more head.
I think that's probably even truer going back to like Mutant Massacre when the character debuts. Like Sabretooth doesn't have his Barry Bonds bulk up until like later in the 90s, and like I guess kind of everyone does. That'll actually be an interesting thing to like track, is like when does everyone find the same steroids and like start doubling in size,
Wow. It's got to start here with Barry Bonds Cable, but
Cable, I think Cable might be the one who's like, hey, I brought all this cream from the future. Put this on your knees. and see what happens.
Oh my god.
Yeah. But no, I do think like issues 87 and 90, I really think are an effective introduction of this character. They lead into a lot of mystery. Like we said, they tie in Freedom Force. They have, and again, like the New Mutants, Bob Harris, if he's the editor, I think both the Wheezy story and the Liefeld story are like, as the editor, he was like, hey, we should probably get an adult back in charge of these kids again. I think that idea was correct. I think like having, and I think one thing that's nice about Cable, so like the 87 through 90 is like, it's just cosmic coincidence that these, the New Mutants and Cable all run into each other, right? And they bump into each other, and then Cable's like, hey, I'm going to stay around, and I'm going to be the leader of these kids. And then what happens as these issues progress, as we go from like 91 through 94 in the Build to Extinction agenda, is there's a surprising level of compassion and like just honestly just like friendliness that Cable has towards these younger mutants. Because I think of him as 90s X-Force gruff, militant, impossible to like he would never hang out with kids. You know what I mean? And
he's almost Batman.
Yeah, right. In a lot of ways, and he has that militancy, I guess, kind of kicks in here, where like his training regimens are really hard. But then again, like he has a softer side. Like he takes walks with Rain Sinclair and like has conversations and like has some, and he smiles here and there and he cheers for himself when he finishes the Danger Room. There's a fun to Cable that I think Louis Simonson brings out that is not often thought of, and will probably get kind of like weeded out of the character as this progresses. And I would say for worse. I actually like him when he's got a little more of that balance to him.
There's that ridiculous scene in issue 89 in which Cable has just pulled himself out of a lake, I think, after crashing.
It's my favorite.
After crashing his attack helicopter. And then he just tells the kids, no, you remain behind and you deal with the Blob and Pyro. I am leaving. Children, please. I need your courage right now.
I so love this kid, though, this like 8-year-old who sees a crazy bionic man pop out of the Hudson, and his reaction is, wait here, mister, I'll get the cops. He's like instead of running away screaming, which is the only sane reaction to what he just saw. Yeah, no, it's amazing. There's a lot of fun stuff like that where when it just in that comics, like put aside realism and just have fun with it for a minute, and it's good stuff. There's some really interesting stuff here too. So you get Old Man Cable comes back. We don't really know that he's coming back in time. Like there's a sense of like he's a time traveler at this point, but there's none of his like I'm from the future, none of his like I'm on a war against apocalypse. None of that's here yet.
Yeah.
None of that stuff is laid out. But what you do get that is interesting, I think, in a contemporary perspective as well, is in these issues, there's also a fair amount of Moira McTaggart, who obviously anything that she's in now, post House and Powers, is like super fascinating. And this is during the build to Claremont's Muir Island saga, which is one of his final, if not his final, kind of X-Men crossover. And basically what this means is there's a whole phase of like Dark Moira, okay, where she's like, she is being manipulated, and we don't know the details of it yet. Okay, and I guess I won't spoil the Muir Island saga for those of you who haven't read it yet. But essentially, she's clearly acting out of character, and the ways we know that is she starts dressing real sexy. Like that's like scary sign number one.
She gets that stupid costume.
And
she steals Cyclops' jacket.
And she steals
that Rogue's. Yeah, it's probably Rogue's.
I mean, I feel like Rogue would be more her fit, but either way. Yeah. But it is funny because, and we'll see this in Uncanny X-Men, but the idea of like sexy X-Men costumes, all the skin tight yellow and blue latex, stuff, that actually starts with like Moira and her Muir Island mutants. Like they're the first ones to start wearing those, Moira chief among them. And she also starts really acting out of character in that she's like, very kind of rude and snappy towards Rain Sinclair, who is her ward, who is her adopted daughter. And like, it is interesting because she's not like so like crazy out of character that you'd be like, oh, something's obviously wrong. Like there's actually a balance to it where she's just really strict in a way that we do not remember her acting. And again, if you're reading Uncanny at the same time, you kind of know like, they're seeding this in other ways too. Like she's being similarly cold towards Banshee. They've had a long time romantic interest. She's acting strange. Clearly something's going on. And what I'll say is it's all building towards Muir Island. But what I find especially interesting as we build to that event is like, how do you reconcile that with post House and Powers Moira? You know, this idea where, okay, this character in X-Men history, what we know from Jonathan Hickman's story in House number 2 is like, this is her 10th timeline, right? And she knows all this history about mutant kind because she's lived all these lifelines, and secretly she's a mutant herself. What was happening here in Moira world when she was getting like possessed and controlled, right? Like, is this a part of her plan? Is this new in this timeline? All of these questions to me are fascinating. And long story short, this is why I need a Moira X series that answers all these questions.
Seriously, there are just so many things that would be more easily explained. God, I would kind of love I mean, it gets used too much, but I would kind of love a Moira X series that somehow has a weird crossover with Department H. Like, if Department H got created because they realized there's somebody who keeps coming back.
Interesting. Yeah.
Just because it'd be fun to see Moira, who's basically an institution on herself because of all the time travel, versus an actual institution that's willing to take the same measures she is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you could do a lot with Department H, with the Weapon X programs, and what has now become Orcus, you know, this Hickman concept of all of these organizations coming together and fueling the resources of AIM and Hydra and whatnot in, like, you know, in defense of humanity. Honestly, you could do a lot where, like, Department H was a predecessor of that, or was building to that point, where, like, yes, they're making Wolverines for murder purposes, but on the side, the real purpose of them was, you know, Destiny leaked them a line that said, hey, watch out for Moira, or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, like mutants are coming, they have these big plans. I think there's some really fun ways you could sneak that in, where, because with an agency like that, with a Department H, where they're all covert, they're all spy ops, they're all under the table anyway, you can kind of mess with continuity and change them up, because it's all hidden in secret anyway, you know, like, it doesn't change anything.
Yeah. Plus, their levels of, you know, memory implants and repression is always something you can play with, is what 30 years of Wolverine has taught us.
Yeah, exactly. So, speaking of Wolverine, he shows up, of course, in the obligatory guest spot,
of course,
in X-Men 93 or New Mutants rather, 93 and 94. I do think once you get out of that first story arc of 87 to 90, where it's clearly, at least it feels to me like a clear Simonson-Liefeld collaboration. I think that's the best of the bunch. It's a good mystery. It sets up Cable as the leader of this team. They're very good comics. I recommend people read them. Once you get out of that, then things start to slip, and you start to get literal creative change. Like, you get Fabian Nicieza's scripts in issue. You get, like, somebody else. Like, there's a whole new creative unit for, like, issue 92 that is none of the players that you recognize. And then, but you also get Liefeld, I think, kind of feeling himself a little bit, kind of being like, this is my book now, and clearly, like, literally transitioning towards that as we build towards New Mutants 100 being the final issue of this series. The details start to slip a little bit as well, I think, in the art and in the storytelling. And by the time we get to, like, 93 and 94, it's kind of just a showcase to be like, hey, we want to do cool Wolverine Cable battles, you know? And everything else is kind of just an excuse to, like, maybe drop some new Strife art, drop some new character designs. This is where, for me, I'm intrigued by what's happening, but I'm definitely less like, no, these are actually surprisingly good than I felt with the early part of the run, I guess. And two, I think Louis Simonson seems like way too nice a person to ever, like, fully admit this, but I have to think she was just like, get me out of here at this point. You know, like, she's basically being pushed out of the office.
Yeah, there's some writing on the wall, I think, for her. I mean, this kind of goes back to, like, the Marvel style of doing comics, where you have a script writer, you have the artist interpret the script writer just writes a rough outline of what happens. Artist interprets it, adds in elements as necessary, and moves stuff around. And then the original author, or another one, comes back to write the dialogue, to explain what it is we're saying on screen, or on page, rather. And there's a lot of obvious points to that in those earlier ones. Like, in 88, there's a moment where Cable says, "You have reason to go to the devil," which is like, were you trying to take up an actual space with a word bubble? Were you trying to cover something? Because that sentence is way more awkward than she would usually craft. There's another part where, let's see, I know I've got this note. There's a portion where they're talking about the fact that the Mutant Liberation Front is going after nuclear equipment, and what is it? That's the tritium commando. That's a radioactive element used to the manufacture of hydrogen bombs. What? There are bits like that where like we never see hydrogen bombs in that issue. I don't think.
No,
we don't see silos or anything. There's just
they're going after mysterious elements, and that's what they do. Yeah, no, there's definitely that feels very Liefeld, X-Force, but also Image Comics to me. Like I feel like every issue of Jim Lee's Wildstorm or like Stormwatch, so once that starts, that exact sentence of dialogue is in the issue, and it's the driver of visuals, and you know what I mean? Like there's just this vague sense of like, oh, they're going after nuclear or radioactive materials, and it's like, okay. I actually kind of appreciated it in that once you get to the back half in 91 to 94, Strife and the MLF's plot is basically the Joker's poison the water well. like it's basically like we're gonna poison the water supply with this, mysterious drug thing, because everyone's battling mysterious drugs in this era as well. What do you make of like Strife as this era? Like was that a villain that at the time or even now, like you found interesting, or is he only interesting because we know he's going to have this weird tie to Cable, Yeah,
I never found him that interesting. Like I really appreciate going back and rereading this, how much they had laid him out to be like a classic villain, right? Yeah. Like from the very first time we meet him, he's choking Wildside, I think it is. And he constantly has these villain speeches, and he's dressed up like if Matt Wagner owned a Benihana. He's just this like to that point earlier about Rob's aesthetic. Like he's just a supervillain, and that's fun for a while. But that back and forth, will they, won't they? Who's the real clone? Who's the real son?
Yeah.
That whole thing I got real tired of real quickly.
It is the challenge with like, so this is something it's happening a lot in Cable right now in the ongoing. I don't know how caught up you are on the Jerry Duggan Phil Noto run, but I will say like there's a temptation, I think, with creators like perpetually. We've never we've learned none of our clone mistakes, I guess is kind of what I'm getting at. Where like there's a temptation to be like, hey, wouldn't it be kind of cool if we didn't know who was the real clone? And then what happens is if you let that thread run too long, it's always a problem, right? This is the Amazing Spider-Man Clone Saga lesson, is like, you had a kernel of an idea, great, but you let it run forever. And that's kind of what Cable and Strife often feels like, where it's, I love the design. I mean, I do. I love just the knives everywhere. Every part of him is glimmering. It's so welcome to the 90s, both him and Cable. Even now, like when that design gets modernized, I'm like, hell yeah, sign me up. I want to see every artist's rendition of Strife.
Yeah.
No questions asked. As far as like his actual personality and like what he's after, he's only interesting to me by proxy. He's only interesting to me when he's being toyed with by Apocalypse, or like that's interesting to me. Or if Cable's like, I'm going to shut you down, Strife, stop doing weird stuff. Like those types of threads are interesting to me. I think if you take him devoid of either of those characters, what even is he? And it almost would be interesting to see that story, but at the same time, I have a feeling the answer is not good because it's probably nothing. Like there's probably nothing to it. I think the Mutant Liberation Front, there's more opportunity to be like, where are they now with this weird ragtag group of characters that have had so little development in most, like Tempo. So Marvel announced the reason I had that comment about the Tempo Renaissance is Marvel did like a vote for like who's going to be the next X-Men, and Tempo was among like the 8 characters they listed, these kind of like C/D tier characters, and Tempo got a lot of popularity because it is this character where it's like, okay, yeah, a creator could step in and fill the gaps on a character that has been so limited and so untapped. I feel like with most of the Mutant Liberation Front, you kind of have that. In ways that are particularly interesting in the Krakoa era because they are quote unquote ex-terrorists, but the Krakoa era is, Krakoa is for all mutants. So it's all about like reconciling those pasts with actually being pro-mutant here in the future. And that's why I actually like a lot of those designs and that Liefeld energy of just like, and here's a character, and she's called Dragoness. And why is she called Dragoness? I don't know. But like that's a story for someone else to tell. I feel like a lot of what he's doing, and this is what he did in the 90s when he was at his best, I would say, was when he said, here's an idea. Hey, Alan Moore, do you want to do better with this? And then Alan Moore came in and did a great job, you know?
Yeah, the shame of it is like, it's very clear that like Liefeld has some great ideas, but he doesn't seem to like to write rule sets around them. Like this is actually how the power works, or this is a definitive answer about something, so we can mess with it later. You know, the stuff that Rick Remender likes to play with.
Yeah,
he's not big there, but he is big on, as you said, just throwing out wild ideas that are not at all pinned down. Like everything that we know about Cable's history comes from his miniseries for the most part. Well, either it comes earlier in X-Men when he's still an infant, or it comes from that later, I think it's Niceza's run actually, in the early 90s on Cable's thing, that gives him the entire backstory, explains everything with Strife. Just a lot of that comes from right then. But like, yeah, I mean, Tempo could be interesting in another person's hands. Right now, when he introduces her, she looks like some thought through juggernaut.
Yeah, right. No, for sure. Like there's not, and I would say even that level of like, what's the word? Like a level of like not providing enough detail to characters extends to even the New Mutants, ironically, of this era, because the kids themselves, it's the weird tug and pull of like Louis Simonson's whole New Mutants run is obviously all the kids. It's so focused on Sam and Bobby and Rain, and by this point the team is then like Boom Boom and who am I forgetting? And Richter is the new one, right?
Yeah.
And Louis Simonson's run is so focused on like who are these kids as people? How do they deal with all of the craziness of their lives? And then as they get pushed into the world of Cable and the world of Liefeld designs and the Mutant Liberation Front, they lose so much of who are they actually? Because they just become pawns but they become Cable's chess pieces. And you can feel that happening even here in these early days of these issues where like they still have moments, like Richter has a moment, like stepping out and not wanting to fight alongside Cable. He's like, that's too much for me. But then he gets caught by Sabretooth and he's threatened. So you do get a lot of internalizing of what they're thinking. I think that's all Simonson, because by the time we get to X-Force with these kids, they're purely soldier chess pieces until we get to Fabian Nicieza, until we get to like new writers and scripters who are a little more interested in investing back in these characters. I think in that regard, if you're a fan of these kids as characters, this isn't necessarily a win for them. I just do think big picture, there is so much of New Mutant kid-centric story from, 1985 through 1990 that it's like if you're actually like reading through the title, it's like this series needed a jump, like it needed a kickstart, whether we're talking sales, which I don't care about now, but just as a reader of the story, like it needed something new, and Cable provides a flavor that is surprisingly successful, again because like you mentioned, most of the things that I think are cool about Cable come much later. They come in Executioner Song, which is 2 years from now. They come in the Cable Mini, like you said, which starts in like 1993. And then they come like, throughout the 2000s, right? Like there's some cool runs. Post-Messiah Complex, I think it's Dwayne Swarzynski writes a run that I really like about him hopping through time with Hope Summers, which is, again, like you get a feel for who Nathan Summers as a character actually is. But at this point, we don't even know who's Summers. It's very up in the air whether it was intended that he would be until later. I'm not even going to get it's another basically like creator, issue where it's like, I think Liefeld has claimed in interviews that in X-Force, he was teasing it. He was teasing that he knew that, but then that didn't come until he was well off the title. So who knows, right? It's a debate.
I think part of that would have worked out better with the whole Cable and changeover thing if he had jumped in right after the death of Doug Ramsey. Because then you would have had the impetus for why the kids had to be soldiers. Yeah. Like so quickly.
Right. That's an interesting point. Because right now the impetus is just like, it has been so long since they've had a direction. It's just like they are just on their own without literally like, they are just like a group of teens with a giant mansion to themselves. Because Magneto bailed. He's in the Hellfire Club. Like, I don't think he even goes to the mansion to pick up his new outfit change. Like, he's done, And, now you're right. I think post-Doug, it also would have been interesting in terms of Magneto losing them to another adult. and the dynamic and
Yeah.
tension you would have had between Cable and Magneto, because you lose that at this
Yeah.
point.
Or if they could have, if they could have explored the fact that there was that downtime in between where the kids felt abandoned.
Right.
Like, actually, you would sign up with this crazy half bionic future soldier man who on day one tells you to redesign your costume so that they show team unity and personal expression or something, personal individuation.
I do love when somebody when somebody like a Cable is like, hey, I've got a lot of thoughts on design. Like I know you guys think of me as this military leader, but I'm a costume designer as well.
Yeah.
And here's what I think.
Yes.
It's wonderful. When
we're gonna have to Robert Nagel this. I'm sorry.
Well, and so the other thing that you just alluded to that I forgot about is post Doug. They lose Ileana as well, post Inferno. So this team really hits,
and Legion.
They hit some trauma during this stretch of time and some loss, and they are definitely in need of some support, because the other thing too is like, not only did they lose Magneto as the headmaster, but they lose like the X-Men as a presence, because post Fall of the Mutants, they pretend to be dead for a long time and hang out in the Australian outback. And then, so they just
leaving children to do the work.
I know. Everyone just leaves the New Mutants behind. Like they're relatively abandoned. And I guess Moira's kind of got like a presence with her Mira, but she's in Scotland. It's the 80s. You don't even have Skype and Zoom at that point. Like they can't connect. I guess they kind of do. They have their version, because we see Moira in her, black leather bikini acting slightly different. All right. Any other major takeaways from this era of New Mutants? For those of you who are with us live, I see a bunch of these questions. I will try to answer some of them as we kind of wrap up here. But, thanks so much for joining. If you do have questions, via the super chat, definitely that is greatly appreciated. Any support you can provide there. Otherwise, I'll just scroll through and see what we can get to. But John, what are your other main takeaways from this era of New Mutants?
I as I said, I'd really forgotten how good some of those early Rob Liefeld issues can be.
Yeah.
You see, it's interesting that you see it after the changeover from the annual, where it starts becoming more screen doors in the background, more larger panels or splash pages, stuff that we see as a crutch. But before that, he does some great work, and honestly, some very good perspective work, which was interesting for him. Issue 92 being done by Dwight Zimmerman and Bob Hall is such a big change in the middle of that book.
Yeah.
Hall's not great in terms of consistency on his issue. So he's got that same issue with Liefeld, that the characters look considerably different between pages and panels and stuff. But he's got this cyberpunk Cable thing going on.
Yeah, it's interesting.
With like a James O'Barr mohawk, which is great.
Yeah, and it's a much more slender Cable, than Liefeld's design. He's so much less bulky. It's actually very interesting.
Yeah, watching his Cable move around makes a lot more sense than Liefeld's.
Right.
Because his guy actually looks like he might be athletic or acrobatic in some way.
Yeah. But unfortunately, the issue itself, there's not a lot to grab onto, and it feels like a fill-in, and it literally is, but it doesn't do the thing of like, and it's a really interesting step away from the main plot. Unfortunately, it just feels like they just didn't have the talent. Like Rob needed the time to draw these next issues, I guess.
Yeah, between that and the Atlantis issue, the annual.
Yeah.
Both of those are just such wasted opportunities.
Yeah, unfortunately. But yeah, so from here, the series is going to progress to Extinction Agenda, where it's going to cross over with all of the Uncanny and what else, X Factor during this era. I would definitely recommend people read at least 87 to 90 prior to Extinction Agenda. I think it does. I think, one, they're good, and I think it also helps to get a feel for, because it is such a status quo shift. It's not a House Powers, reinvent the universe thing. But it is like, New Mutants is something else now. For all intents and purposes, like the debut of Cable, the book basically becomes X-Force #1. You know what I mean? Like it's like a soft launch of what that new franchise is going to be. I was reading, so in the conversations around creative credits and all that, you get Liefeld's story about why he joined the saga and how the book was dying and how he came on to save it and this and that, right? And some of that, there's some truth. But one thing I found really interesting was he wanted initially to put all of these ideas in a relaunched Alpha Flight #1, and like everything, yeah, like so, like all his cable and all these designs was and Strife and all that, like that was going to be his Alpha Flight #1, and for some reason, Marvel was like, we don't want to reboot Alpha Flight. Isn't that the craziest thing you've ever heard? That they were like, yeah, Alpha Flight 77 is too hot right now. We can't reboot this with the #1. I couldn't believe that.
Well, I guess it makes more sense given the fact that they were trying to save something that had been selling better. But yeah, like for having that much freedom to move, and it makes more sense because Alpha Flight is so much more militant than New Mutants is.
Yeah.
So this change winds up being this kind of interesting bellwether for the 90s, in that previously, especially during Claremont's run and Weezy's earlier run, the book is intentionally so much different than the normal X-Men books. That's the kids don't feel as conflict heavy in terms of battle, and when they do, it feels momentous.
Yeah.
Which is part of what makes like the fight with the Demon Bear saga so huge, is because they just feel like kids who hadn't really taken on anything like this.
Right.
And now as Cable moves them just to being another child soldier arm of Professor Xavier's ongoing war, that says a lot for how the 90s changed comics. And it's interesting, though, that this book doesn't go the full distance on it, that they don't really lean into that fact of like, hey, you were teenagers, now we're going to start, wet works.
Well, and that's a really good point, because it is kind of time for these kids to grow up a little, right? Like you can't stay the doe-eyed, fresh-faced kids, of the New Mutants forever, right? And they've been, again, like their series is approaching 100 issues. It does kind of make sense to transition, like, well, what is the next phase? And I think that is something that the New Mutants roster, whether we're talking Danny Moonstar, Karma, all the good characters that are in the book right now, it's something they face kind of perpetually, is like, okay, how do we transit? It's a Marvel problem too with the sliding time scale, where it's like, how do we transition you from being young to old, but not too old, because you're still the New Mutants, so you're not actually going to age like totally, because then our X-Men would have to age proportionally, and we can't do that. But you can get them, because like where they are now in Krakoa space in the New Mutants, which is a title that has really been rejuvenated by the creative unit of Vita Ayala and Rod Rice, is they're like they're clearly like mentors. They are the teachers, right? Yeah. And it's a role that they're like, but they're the young teachers. And it's a role that makes a ton of sense for them, like taking the actual kid mutants of the island under their wing. And because they've learned so much and been through so much, it makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of what this era of New Mutants is trying to do with Simonson and Liefeld, in their own way of saying, well, we were kids fighting all these battles anyway. Why don't we actually get ourselves a strategic leader and become his mutant army? And it's, it is kind of literalizing what you're saying of Professor X's mutant armies of the original 5 mutants, where these were young kids who he was sending into battle all the time. It doesn't necessarily explore what that means a whole heck of a lot, for these characters.
It's not super dramatic about it either.
It's not. It's kind of just like.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I find it so funny given how obvious all the other work is in the book, like how blindingly obvious Cable is as a character, or at least his function at the time of just being big, gruff, super soldier with bionic arm man, and how like clear so many other things are in their definition, that this piece would just sort of be like a slow boil, like as a changeover. It's like that frog in the pot of water. Yeah. Apocryphal story.
Yeah. No, you're right. Like it doesn't hit you over the head with Sam blasting into battle being like, I'm a soldier now, like literally declaring what is happening, as clearly as you think it might. Yeah, they're kind of just game for it. And on one hand, it kind of makes sense, because it is like, that's kind of been their life anyway. They just weren't wearing the military outfits with the military leader, but that's kind of been what they've always been doing, is like, like right before this, like they're in Asgard fighting the hordes of hell. Like these kids are used to this craziness. Like that's kind of just been their life. So yeah, I think big picture, New Mutants 87 to 94, it's pretty interesting. It's pretty important, I guess, in terms of continuity and where this franchise is going. I think next time in the 90s Reading Club, you can find all the issues here in the show notes that I'm planning to talk through and read, but we are going to talk a little bit about Uncanny X-Men and kind of the rise of Jim Lee. on the franchise and the debut of Gambit, actually, as a character. Because we do, we're in the 90s. This is when we get Cable, we get Gambit. Obviously, we'll progress to Bishop here in the near future. You get some nice additions of new characters. And it is interesting reading their earliest iterations because very few characters come out fully baked. I think that Doctor Doom is like the best example of Stan and Jack were like, hey, here's everything about this character that you need to know in Fantastic Four #5. And they kind of nailed it. Like there's like one thing that gets added later, but otherwise that's Doom. But otherwise most characters, it takes some time. It takes some moments. I think Cable comes out pretty well, I think. And there's a reason this character had success. It's kind of funny because I don't think his design's actually that cool. Like he's like this balding Terminator who's not wearing enough clothes. Like it's not like cool in the way that you would think it would be.
True,
but obviously the character's had a ton of success, and a lot of fans.
I have to challenge you on the. I have to challenge you on the eye paradox. That he's got the one eye that glows and the one eye with a scar over it, but they're not the same eye.
You're right. That is very cool. And that does work.
That's everything.
Right, because two different stories. You got two different stories. How did he lose one eye, and how did he get a scar on the other? We don't know. All right, so Cable's pretty cool. I'll admit it. Let's answer just a couple questions here quick. Again, if people do have questions they want to get in the chat, that's appreciated. The super chat is super appreciated if you are feeling generous. There's a question here, John. What is your favorite 90s X-Men story? Also the worst?
Oh, boy. Favorite 90s X-Men story. Are we talking all X books or X-Men the title?
Let's open it up. We could say all.
Okay. It's probably going to be, there's a late issue in Larry Hama's run. It's well past 50. So Wolverine and Jubilee are off exploring something or whatever. They're in the desert and they wind up running across a mostly destroyed Sentinel that's now targeting them. And it is part of the situation when the two of them finally defeat it. The thing gains self-awareness, and it buries itself in the desert to contemplate how it was wrong, and it lists out this like thousands upon thousands of days in the future.
Yeah,
is the processing time it's going to take for it to get there, and it's one of those real simple, real cliche. Best ways to get people's attention is to say no one knows what happened next, which is essentially what that story is doing. But I have spent ever since reading that comic trying to figure out like where does this tie in?
Yeah.
When is this moment? Is it part of Grant Morrison's Here Comes Tomorrow? Where is this? Is it part of Moira's story? Who knows?
Yeah.
But it's just a really well done, interesting comic from what I remember.
Love it.
It's like part of a 2 or 3 part series.
Amazing. I need to read a lot more of that Wolverine run. That's something I'm excited to do for this 90s era, because that's a bit of a blind spot for me.
It's so much fun. Larry Hama does a great job just being utterly... I sort of would have liked to have seen Larry Hama's run on Cable, actually.
Yeah.
Given the fact that Hama was himself... I think he served in Korea, I want to say.
It could be.
Korea or Vietnam.
Could be.
But he did serve.
He was on an episode of Saturday Night Live. I know that. It's not the same.
I didn't know that.
That's a weird bit of Larry Hama trivia.
That is very strange indeed.
Yeah.
Worst one? Man, I don't know. Phalanx Saga got better, but at the time it was pretty lame.
Phalanx Saga has the benefit now of hindsight and of being super relevant, which I think otherwise, otherwise it would suffer tremendously. But that is the thing about, I've said this on the My Marvelous Year podcast. My co-host there, Zach, was like, because we argue a lot about X-Men. I like it a lot more than he does, just generally. And, I've said to him, like, I could literally read any X-Men based comic at this point and find it very interesting. Like, I don't have the same level of like critical, like, I don't like this anymore, because I'm like, even in this bad, totally forgotten, undiscussed comic, what is the weird bit of continuity that's like kind of relevant now? You know what I mean? Like there's just all these weird little details that feel like they could surface again at any moment and be kind of fun and a thing that writers and creators can play with. So I kind of don't have obvious worst ofs. I think for me, the period where I fall out is consistently it's the Onslaught saga, which I like ideas
Yeah.
of. It's kind of got that Spider-Man Clone Saga thing of this is a Marvel bankruptcy story that went forever because they just were just letting things go because like nobody knew what the
Yeah.
tomorrow was going to bring. They didn't know when the company like what the company was going to be. That's kind of what Onslaught feels like. I would say like back half of Onslaught for me is like it's going too long and they don't have much more to do with this idea and it's a slog. It's hard to get through.
That's a good pick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite, instead of a favorite 90s thing, because I'm going to talk about a bunch of them, I will say my favorite Cable stories I do like that solo post Messiah Complex Cable run written by Dwayne Sprzinski. I think that one it's Cable hopping through time with a initially baby, but then young Hope Summers as they are on the run from Bishop, actually. So you get it's a bad look for Bishop, okay? Like Bishop has been done dirty throughout the 2000s, but as a fan of them having competing time travel ideologies, where Cable's like,
Yeah.
this is the future, and Bishop's like, no, this is the future. It taps into that effectively, where one of them thinks Hope is going to ruin mutant kind, and one of them thinks she's the savior, right? And that's
Yeah.
kind of the framework of it. I like that run a lot. I think otherwise, like modern Cable stuff, that's good. I mean, that's probably the peak for me because from there, really, he's all about just like establishing hope. There's an interesting Dennis Hopeless, I believe he now goes Dennis Hallam, written X-Force, which is Marvel Now era, where it's Cable, Domino, Colossus, maybe Doctor Nemesis, and Hope. That run I remember being fun in the moment, but I haven't revisited it since.
The one I keep wanting to go back to is it's probably not going to hold up as well as I remember, but it was The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, that miniseries from the mid-90s. As that winds up adding a whole bunch to the Cable mythos about the whole business with the Ascani and that tribe in the future. Which
and Rachel
seems so
Summers'
important.
connections to all that, yeah.
Yeah. And like it had an interesting Madeline Pryor and Jean Grey kind of aspect to it as well. And that seemed really important, that storyline in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like it's mostly been dropped off. Like I think it probably got killed off for the most part whenever the last fight was between Cable, Strife, and Apocalypse. Like they had a big throwdown in the mid 2000s.
Yeah,
I think.
I feel like that continuity works still, but I'm not sure how much like the specifics of that future landscape really work anymore. I will say that's something I'm interested to re-explore as I dig through more 90s X-Men is like what actually is Cable's future and like its ties to Apocalypse. Like that's all very vague and amorphous in my head as future timelines kind of have to be, but with Cable I'm always like, because it's not literally like the age of Apocalypse. Like it's not literally like Apocalypse rules everything, but at the same time it's, I don't know, I feel like the 90s animated series shapes more of my perception of like like it's just like Apocalypse is the bad guy, we're always at war with him and it never gets resolved, and I don't really know much more than that, honestly. So I am curious to explore that because I feel like I don't know enough about it, like the future Apocalypse verse.
You must have read Remender's run on X-Force, right?
Oh yeah
because he talks about that in the whole first arc about when they're going to kill, spoilers, when they're going to kill the young Apocalypse. They talk about the fact that like Apocalypse always exists in the future, and whatever. I guess they were running out of iterations at the time somehow.
Yeah.
But like there are always futures where Apocalypse comes about because that's part of mutant kind's destiny. So I always just sort of figured that Cable was always going to have a future with Apocalypse because no matter what he did to change this one, there's another one out there, and he's just going to retrack.
Right. I think that works. There's some really interesting stuff in that X-Force run, which I probably would like to revisit at some point. That's definitely on my.
It's good.
It's so good, and it's one of my top 5. Like, if I just had like no other obligations, like I would just reread a series. Like that's definitely probably that, like the Hickman verse, like the whole thing. I don't know what the rest off the top of my head. Original Secret Wars, just comics. I would be like, I will just read this just for like the fun and for the memories of it. But one thing that I know gets
Daniel O'Neill stretch on Batman,
sure,
like the whole Bat family.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's actually like the Morrison Batman. That's kind of perpetually up there for me too. But one thing from that run that came up a lot during Ten of Swords was like, hey, what about the Apocalypse iterations? Like, what about this being the eighth Apocalypse or the ninth Apocalypse kind of thing? Like that has gotten.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a thing they're gonna play with much in this era of X-Men, but it's a thing that Remender tossed out there that was very interesting and that they could revisit. Because in that run, again, spoilers, but like you have the whole Dark Angel saga, which then gives us, a quote unquote new apocalypse. Whereas I think in the
Yeah.
Hickman era of X-Men, we very much have the perspective of there is one apocalypse. There is En Sabah. This is apocalypse. There aren't people who take that mantle. Like it's a person, it's not a mantle. And I think that is
Yeah.
they're interesting, different visions of what that character could be. I don't know that one's right or wrong necessarily. It's
Yeah.
just which one you choose.
Sometimes it's a seed that takes host in someone. There's like a whole
Like the celestial
I mean, the
seeds
person
thing.
who
Yeah, because that's the thing that
yeah,
I don't really feel like this era is playing with at all. Like all the celestial connections.
just less.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're probably going to save that for Eternals, the film.
yeah, sure.
But you know who would have answers to all of this? Louise Simonson, who wrote the sections we just talked about, as she created Apocalypse way back in like X Factor 8 or something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and they're gonna have
Plus the Dark Angel saga.
editor on that, right?
Yeah.
But
I don't think she was editor. I think she was editor.
we're
Yeah.
gonna have Luis and Walt back together again on X-Men Legends coming up, doing an X Factor Apocalypse style story, which will be interesting.
Nice.
Yeah. What is your do you like, do you love, do you hate the Simonson X Factor? What's your stance on that?
The Simonson X Factor, like it adds so much to the mythos that's important. But there's also just a lot of it that feels like I don't know. It feels weird as this holdover group while the X-Men were getting going in a new incarnation with Wolverine and like all the other Rogue and all these other interesting characters. It feels, I don't know, it feels like a legacy, like a stubborn legacy sometimes.
Yeah, I could see that.
Especially their costumes. Their costumes are not good.
No, I did think those costumes were flawed. Yeah, I think the legacy of it is, because you get the creation of Apocalypse, because you get the transition from Warren Worthington into Archangel, you
Yeah.
get some really important, fun stuff that continues and has a
Yeah.
legacy. I do tend to think that work actually does not hold up as well as I want it to. It's got a lot of fandom
No.
and support around it, which always, it's one of those things where I'm like, I feel like fandom is telling me I should like this more than I do, but I know that I'm actually not that into it. That said, I'm curious to see what they're going to bring to X-Men Legends, because it is, I like this idea that Marvel has right now of, hey, we're going to let kind of our quote unquote legacy creators, aka the creators that are too old to pay for modern comics, apparently, right?
Right.
Like there's an underlying insult in that. But we're going to let them revisit bits of continuity that haven't been explored. So like Fabian Nicieza is the one right now who's doing his Adam X story. He finally gets to wrap up his how he intended Adam X.
Your favorite.
Yeah, I know, it's incredible. I'm actually interviewing Fabian 2-ish weeks from now, about a week from now, week and a half.
Nice.
So I'll be live here with him on that, which should be pretty interesting. He seems like a great interview. When I've listened to stuff, he's like super candid and like he's just like super like no filter about like Marvel history and just like what do I need to hide things for anymore? So it should be an interesting time.
Yeah.
All right, cool, John. This has been a pleasure. I think is there anything else you wanna wrap with?
No, I think we're good here.
Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely try to have you back for some more 90s X-Men stuff. Thanks to everybody who was here on the chat, listening here live, and of course, those of you who tune in later, it is appreciated as well. Again, I'm Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com. You can subscribe and like the channel here at Comic Book Herald. Do a bunch of shows like Krakin and Krakoa, where we talk all things X-Men. I review all the new issues as they come out Wednesdays and talk about kind of big picture what is going on for mutant kind. But of course, we'll be exploring the history more in 90s X-Men. You can read the comics that we're going to have coming up about the debut of Gambit here in the next time we get to it. So I think in general, I'll be trying to do these types of things like every couple weeks. Although I will say that in April, schedules are looking weird. They are looking wonky. So it'll be whenever.
Yeah,
I can
mine's
do
looking pretty bad myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So, all right, I'm going to end the live stream here again. Thanks so much for joining. And yeah,
Absolutely.
we'll talk later.
Take care, everybody.